Sometimes, the smallest seed of kindness planted in barren soil can grow into a tree of miracles. The winter had come early to the small, isolated village, bringing with it biting winds and thick blankets of snow that covered every path and field. The river, once bustling with life and laughter in the warmer months, now lay frozen under a thick layer of ice. The villagers huddled indoors, their faces pale and drawn as they tried to survive the harshest winter they had ever known. In a modest home at the edge of the village lived a woman named Miriam. Her house was small, with walls patched to keep out the cold and a single well-worn chair by the hearth. Her possessions were few: a cracked clay mug, a roughly woven shawl, and a small wooden bed covered in thin blankets. Yet, despite her modest means, there was a warmth to her home that had nothing to do with fire. The villagers knew Miriam as the kind one. She had lived a life marked by hardship and loss, yet she bore it with a resilience and generosity that astonished those who knew her. When her parents had passed away during her youth, Miriam could have turned bitter, like so many others who struggled alone. But instead, she had let her heart grow wide with compassion, offering whatever she had to those in need. This winter, however, tested even Miriam's resilience. The harvest had been poor, and the village's stores of food were running low. Every morning, as she looked into her near-empty cupboard, she whispered a prayer for strength. Her meals grew smaller with each passing day, but she clung to her belief that kindness, even in scarcity, was a light in the darkness. As the weeks dragged on, fear began to take hold of the village. People, once friendly neighbors, started keeping their doors tightly shut, hoarding what little they had. It was as though the cold had seeped into their hearts, hardening them against one another. Conversations became scarce, and the warmth that had once filled the village faded, replaced by an air of isolation and distrust. Miriam saw the change and felt a deep sadness for her neighbors. She understood their fear, but she also knew that fear could lead to a loneliness far colder than the winter wind. Each day, she made it her mission to visit those around her, bringing with her whatever small gifts she could spare: a piece of stale bread, a half-empty bottle of oil, a few dried herbs. Her presence, even more than the gifts themselves, seemed to lift their spirits, a reminder that they were not alone. One afternoon, she visited an elderly couple who lived in a cottage at the far edge of the village. The husband, nearly blind, relied on his wife for everything, but she had fallen ill with a fever, leaving them both helpless. Miriam spent hours there, nursing the old woman and preparing a small warm meal with the few ingredients she had brought. When she left, she felt a pang of hunger herself, but her heart was full. The look of gratitude in their eyes had been worth every sacrifice. The other villagers noticed her kindness, some watching from their windows as she trudged through the snow each day. Some whispered in awe of her generosity, while others shook their heads, wondering why she would give away what little she had when there was no guarantee that anyone would help her in return. But Miriam paid no mind to their whispers. She was driven by a purpose greater than her own comfort. As the days passed, Miriam's supplies dwindled. She had given nearly all she had, and her cupboard held only a single piece of bread and a small clay cup filled with water. Yet, even as her own hunger grew, she felt a peace within her, a quiet assurance that kindness was the right path, no matter the cost. One night, as she sat by the faint glow of her dying fire, she heard a soft knock at her door. The sound was so gentle that at first she thought she had imagined it. But when it came again, a bit louder, she rose slowly, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders, and went to answer it. Standing in the doorway was a man, thin and weathered, his face drawn with exhaustion. His clothes were torn and his hands were raw from the cold. He looked at her with eyes that held both desperation and a quiet dignity, as though he was unaccustomed to begging but had no other choice. "Please," he whispered, his voice rough and weak. "I have come from far away and have nothing left. Is there anything at all, you can spare?" Miriam looked at him, her heart aching with compassion. She understood that look. She had felt it herself, that gnawing emptiness that left a person hollow. Though she had only a small piece of bread and a cup of water left, she felt a warmth inside her, a voice urging her to give what she could. "Come inside," she said softly, guiding him to her chair by the fire. She wrapped him in her own thin blanket, kneeling beside him as she handed him the bread and water. "It isn't much," she apologized, "but I hope it will bring you some comfort." The man looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Why would you give your last bit of food to a stranger?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. Miriam smiled, her face soft with kindness. "Because kindness is like a seed. When we plant it, we may not see it grow, but it will blossom somewhere in some way." The man ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. As he finished, he looked at her, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I will remember this kindness," he promised. "And I will repay it, though you may never see how." Miriam watched him go, her heart filled with a deep sense of peace. She had given her last meal, yet she felt as though she had received something far greater. As she lay down that night, her stomach empty but her soul content, she whispered a prayer, asking for nothing but peace for those who suffered. When Miriam awoke the next morning, she was greeted by an incredible sight. Her doorstep was piled high with baskets overflowing with bread, fresh fruits and vegetables, warm blankets, and even small pouches of coins. She stared in astonishment, hardly able to believe her eyes. It was more than she had ever seen, a bounty beyond her wildest dreams. Atop one of the baskets lay a simple note. It read, "For the kindest heart I have ever known. May your well never run dry." Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she took in the sight. She did not know who had left these gifts, but she felt a profound gratitude fill her heart. She knew deep down that her kindness had not gone unnoticed, that her small act of compassion had somehow blossomed into this miracle. But instead of keeping it all for herself, Miriam did what she always did. She took only what she needed to get through the next few days, and then she spent the morning visiting her neighbors, sharing the bounty with those in need. She went from door to door, offering bread to the hungry, blankets to the cold, and coins to those struggling to make ends meet. As news of her generosity spread, something remarkable happened. The villagers, inspired by her example, began to open their own doors, sharing what little they had with each other. Those who had more gave to those who had less, and soon the entire village was filled with warmth and laughter, a community bound together by kindness. In the weeks that followed, the village transformed. The once isolated families became close-knit, supporting each other through the harsh winter. Where there had been fear, there was now a sense of hope. Where there had been loneliness, there was now fellowship. And at the heart of it all was Miriam, the woman who had shown them the power of kindness. People would often come to her for advice, seeking the wisdom that had guided her through her own hardships. And though she never sought praise or recognition, the villagers began to call her Miriam the Kind, a title she wore with humility and grace. Years passed, and the story of Miriam's kindness became a cherished tale, passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing of the woman who had given her last piece of bread to a stranger, of the miracle that had followed, and of the village that had been transformed by her example. Miriam herself grew old, her hair silver and her hands worn, yet her heart remained as kind and open as ever. She lived a quiet life, surrounded by friends and neighbors who loved her dearly, her legacy living on in every act of kindness that bloomed in the village. And though she never saw the stranger again, she knew that her kindness had touched his life, just as it had touched the lives of everyone in her village. She had planted a seed, and it had grown into a tree of miracles, a testament to the power of love and compassion. Many seasons passed, and Miriam's story became woven into the very fabric of village life. The villagers had come to see Miriam as not only a kind woman but as the heart and soul of their community. The story of the miraculous morning when she found her doorstep laden with gifts had become almost legendary, told and retold until it was difficult to separate fact from the mystery surrounding it. But for Miriam, the truth was simple. She had done what felt right, and love had returned to her in ways she could never have imagined. One crisp autumn morning, Miriam, now older and slower in her steps, was walking through the marketplace when she noticed a figure standing by a stall of bread, gazing at her with a familiar warmth in his eyes. The man was finely dressed, with sturdy clothes and a warm cloak, a stark contrast to the weary traveler she had once known. As he approached her, Miriam recognized him at once. It was the stranger she had helped so many years ago, the man she had welcomed into her home on that cold, starless night. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest in surprise. The man smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Miriam," he said softly, his voice rich with emotion. "I have returned as I promised to repay the kindness you showed me that night." Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she embraced him. "But you have already repaid me," she whispered. "Your kindness transformed my life and the lives of so many here." The man shook his head gently. "What I gave you was only the beginning. Your kindness inspired me to change my own life. I have traveled far and wide, and everywhere I went, I shared the story of the woman who gave her last piece of bread to a stranger. Your kindness has spread farther than you could ever know." Miriam listened, deeply touched, as the man recounted stories of the people he had helped in her honor, the communities he had supported, all inspired by the memory of her generosity. Through her small act of kindness, a chain of love had been set in motion, reaching across lands and people she would never see. The news of the stranger's return spread quickly, and the entire village gathered to celebrate. They brought food, music, and laughter, filling the square with the warmth of fellowship. The villagers sang songs, and elders recounted the tale of Miriam's kindness, now with the stranger himself to witness the telling. There was dancing and storytelling, each person adding their own experience of how Miriam's love had touched their lives. During the gathering, the stranger took Miriam's hand and led her to a small podium in the village square. With the crowd watching, he spoke, his voice clear and filled with reverence. "People of this village," he began, "you may not know my name, but I know yours because Miriam's love has lived in my heart every day since that night. She taught me that kindness is the greatest treasure, a light that guides us even in the darkest times. Today, I wish to honor her by establishing a trust for this village, a fund that will support the poor, feed the hungry, and keep Miriam's legacy alive for generations." The villagers erupted in cheers, clapping and shouting her name. Miriam, overwhelmed with emotion, could barely speak. She thanked the stranger, her heart full as she looked at the community that had grown and thrived through the love she had planted. Her small act of kindness had indeed grown into a miracle. As the years passed, Miriam became a respected elder in the village. Children would come to her, sitting by her feet, listening to her stories and her gentle wisdom. She would tell them about her life, about the power of compassion, and how even the smallest act of kindness could grow into something extraordinary. She taught them to give without expecting anything in return, to love without conditions, and to trust that goodness, though unseen, would find its way back to them. One child, a young girl named Leora, became particularly close to Miriam. Leora had lost her parents and lived with her aunt, who struggled to make ends meet. But Miriam took Leora under her wing, sharing her meals, her stories, and her warmth. She taught Leora to plant flowers and herbs, and as they worked together in the garden, Miriam would remind her that every seed they planted was like an act of kindness. It would grow, often unseen, to bring beauty and life to the world. When Miriam grew too frail to tend to the garden, Leora took over, planting new flowers each season, honoring the lessons she had learned from her beloved mentor. Through Leora, Miriam's love for the earth, for kindness, and for selfless giving continued to blossom. Years went by, and Miriam, now in her 90s, lay in her small, familiar home, surrounded by villagers who had come to say their goodbyes. She had become like a grandmother to them all, her wisdom and love woven into their lives. Though her body was frail, her spirit was as vibrant as ever, her heart still full of kindness and peace. The stranger, now a part of the village himself, sat by her side, holding her hand. As the end drew near, Miriam looked around at the faces of her friends, her neighbors, and the children she had taught, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She whispered her final words, a blessing for all who had gathered. Remember, each act of kindness is a seed. Plant it without asking where it will grow. Love without measure, and trust that your kindness will live on, even when you cannot see its reach. With those words, Miriam closed her eyes, her spirit returning to the source of all love. The village mourned her passing, but they celebrated her life, knowing that she had left them a gift that would endure. In the months following her passing, the villagers dedicated a garden to Miriam's memory. They planted flowers, herbs, and fruit trees, each one a symbol of the kindness she had shown them. Leora, now a young woman, tended the garden with love, nurturing the plants as Miriam had nurtured her. The garden became a sanctuary, a place where people could come to reflect, to give thanks, and to remember the lessons Miriam had taught them. The stranger returned each year on the anniversary of Miriam's passing, sitting quietly in the garden, remembering the woman who had changed his life. And each time he visited, he would bring seeds from his travels, planting them in her honor, knowing that her legacy would continue to grow. Miriam's story spread far beyond the village. Travelers who visited the village heard of the woman who had given her last piece of bread to a stranger, and they carried the tale with them to distant lands. In towns and cities across the region, people would tell the story of Miriam, the kind one, and her legacy of love. Over time, a festival was established in her name, held each winter in the village. People would gather from near and far to celebrate kindness, sharing meals, exchanging gifts, and planting seeds as symbols of hope and compassion. Stories of her life were told to children, who grew up with the knowledge that kindness was a treasure greater than gold. The festival became a beacon of light during the darkest time of year, a reminder that kindness, once planted, would grow in ways no one could predict. Generations passed, and the village itself grew into a bustling town, but the spirit of Miriam remained as strong as ever. Her story became a part of the town's heritage, a tale passed down with reverence and love. The garden, now filled with towering trees and vibrant flowers, stood as a living testament to her life, a place where her spirit could be felt by all who visited. Centuries later, a small plaque was added to the entrance of the garden, inscribed with Miriam's final blessing. Each act of kindness is a seed. Plant it without asking where it will grow. Love without measure, and trust that your kindness will live on, even when you cannot see its reach. The legacy of Miriam, the kind one, lived on in the hearts of people who had never met her but felt the beauty of her life through the garden, the stories, and the kindness passed down through the ages. Her life had shown that even the smallest act of love could ripple out, touching countless lives, transforming hearts, and creating a world rooted in compassion. And so Miriam's light shone on, like a flame passed from one generation to the next, an endless seed of kindness that would bloom forever. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.